Hey, welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Casey. This is the Godward Show. This is going to be an episode on the Diamond Sutra by Buddha. And also, I might eat some Brussels sprouts. And, and I don't have the camera because, I'm downstairs. And the camera is just not worth it when the lighting isn't right. So, here we go. I was reading Michel de Montaigne's essays the other day, in particular the essay called On Books. And the part that really got me, and this is what I love about Montaigne in general, by the way, is how he said that in offering these reflections on the books he loves, he is presenting not a picture of the books, but of himself. Same here. You feel me? Anyway, I know it's kind of a sport among scholars and Suds to pinpoint where the modern age began. And of course, it depends on a lot of things, mainly how you define modern. But one of the elements of modernism that I take to be central is just the kind of self-awareness that Montaigne demonstrates, this hyper-subjectivity that eventually gives rise probably to things like Impressionism and stream of consciousness novels and all of that. I suppose you could find traces of all this in even Gilgamesh, though, or Buddha, certainly, for that matter. And I should say, a lot of people like to credit Shakespeare for turning the corner to what we call the modern. But for me, Montaigne is the one that feels most definitive. When I read him, he feels like he could be alive now, like he could understand me. He writes all these extraordinarily compelling essays about so many different subjects, but at bottom, as he continually reminds us, he himself is the subject of his writing, and nothing else. So even when he writes about something foreign like the cannibals, or ancient like Plutarch, he is chiefly showing us how these things matter to him. And in that way, he makes no objective claims, and he isn't trying to be the biggest brain winning the most arguments on YouTube. The On Books essay resonated with me because that's what books are to me too, to be honest. A mirror, maybe a sandbox for me to play in. And actually, that's probably what this channel is, hidden just barely behind the veneer of it being really decent synopses of classic books. It's just about me, you understand? Take it or leave it. Anyway, that's why I love Montaigne. So in this spirit, in the spirit of confession, almost memoir, I offer this episode that appears to be about the Buddha's well-known sermon, the Diamond Sutra, but I want you to be very aware that the sutra probably means something totally different to the learned monks in India and to so many other people who know more about it than I do. And I will even concede that if I got into an argument with one of these people about what the sermon means, their argument would probably be, and even appear to be, stronger than mine. And yet, I'm going to speak here of what the sermon has meant to me. As Montaigne said, I am myself the substance of my book. And that goes for this podcast as well. Listen for the timer. You'll hear my Brussels sprouts come out. Before I talk about the Diamond Sutra, another word about these reflections. I've been thinking again about what this podcast is or can be, and how it should continue, and so on. The other day, I ordered a juicer because, let me explain why later. But anyway, because I ordered the juicer, I watched a review on YouTube of this one juicer before I ordered it. And it was a lady that reminded me of the Oracle from the Matrix movies, middle-aged black woman, but she was actually less articulate. And what made me laugh is that her channel, which is just reviewing various products, has 81,200 subscribers. And, I just thought that was funny compared to my 700. And then there's the girl that I follow on Twitter who started her libertarian podcast around when I started this one last fall. She's done 9 episodes so far, and they're audio only. And they're like Ayn Rand tier insight. But she sometimes posts pictures of herself on Twitter and she's smoking hot. And so guess who has more subs? She does. Anyway, that's how it goes. I understand. But for this podcast, one of my early objectives was to string together episodes on what I considered to be essential, ancient, or classical reading, in an effort to articulate my own political and theological understanding of how Christianity related to Greek philosophy and how, in my view, it superseded Judaism. Although I may not have done episodes yet on Justin Martyr or Tertullian or Athanasius or St. John Chrysostom to solidify this point, I think I provided enough groundwork in the episodes on Thucydides and Herodotus, and then on the ones on the pre-Socratics, on Parmenides and Heraclitus, and the Plato stuff, and Josephus. And so given all that, I think a person who listens carefully to all these in a sort of curious way should be able to understand what it is I'm saying and what I'm curious about. Then, a secondary aim of the channel was to record distilled versions of some of the lectures that I used to give in college on various 19th and 20th century literature. So, like the Borges and Kafka episodes, and even better in the episodes on Poe and Hawthorne and Melville and Whitman, I put some of my best stuff, Emerson, on tape. So I've put it on tape. I'm happy to have it there. It's there to stay. One other thing this podcast allows me to do is to have this kind of conversation, the kind of conversation that's to follow, I guess, that is obviously a little out of reach for most people, to be honest, because they haven't done the reading that I've done. At least with you guys who listen, even if you haven't read the stuff, you kind of know what I thought was important about these things, and so you can kind of follow my reasoning. But because of that, it allows us to go to places that you couldn't go if you're sort of ice cold. Like we share a content together, All right, let me go pull out I can tell there's like 10 seconds left before my Brussels sprouts come out. I'll be right back. And we're back. Through all of this, then, I ask myself, well, what do I and my viewers know now from these 70 or so episodes? And the main thing that strikes me about all my reading is that there is really kind of a definitive break in intellectual history somewhere after Dante's lifetime. In fact, if anyone wants to help my latest kind of mini research program, I've been talking to a buddy lately, one of my oldest friends, about all this, and our interest is kind of zeroing in on when, and more importantly, how exactly, natural law got replaced by something like the laws of nature as the foundation for the important discussions. It seems to have something to do with telos, or the aim or purpose of things, right? So for example, in the medieval period, it would have been a very normal question to ask, what is the end of all this economic activity? And the answer would not have been to maximize profit, of course. Because ultimately, the medievals believed that the worship of God was the end, and all things had to resolve up into that. But by comparison, in the modern period, a question like, what is the telos of the economy, it doesn't really even make sense. I left the beeper on. The modern understanding is that economic principles are sort of mechanisms or even forces, and so they must simply be organized so as not to cause disaster or something. So, and see, I'm not an expert exactly, but as I try to put this all together in my mind, I know just a few things. Like I know, for example, that Roger Williams, embodying the Protestant mind, called for an end to persecution for the cause of conscience in like 1654. And that although he conceded that Aquinas was correct about usury and price setting, he, Roger Williams, worried whether these economic functions could be effectively regulated, since ultimately such regulation would require interrogating men's consciences. But the point is, when Cotton Mather, just like 50 years later, simply declared usury to be no longer forbidden in 1699, by pre-modern standards, that would have necessitated a tremendously powerful argument, because it negated 1,500 years of thinking on the topic. But among moderns, who don't return to natural law and who don't recall, for instance, that Dante made it a point to describe usury as a perversion of nature, of God's creation, well, among them, there isn't much reason for usury to be illegal. And so all it takes is some influential individual's whim to overturn the traditions. Again, I'm not talking about usury laws so much as how we shifted our mindset from talking about justice in terms of natural law to talking about justice in a more secular and mechanistic way. My recipe for Brussels sprouts is like just in a little cup. You don't even need to measure this stuff. But like a dollop of oil, whatever oil you like, and a dollop of maple syrup, and then just even less of a dollop of apple cider vinegar, just to help mix them together. Garlic, ideally fresh, but even garlic powder works fine, and salt. And sometimes balsamic vinaigrette. And you mix that all together, you put it on the Brussels sprouts. Now, the other thing is, I've been working on chewing lately. Anybody into chewing? I saw one of those, you know that meme that has it's the iceberg, and the further down you get, like the more esoteric the meme is. And I saw one of these, and it was about like health, so at the top it was like exercise and, meditation or whatever. But down somewhere toward the bottom, one of them said, chewing. So I'm really working on chewing my food. I'll finish these and then I'll cut this part out. And so, as I was thinking about all of this stuff, when I posted my last episode on Melville's novel, Pierre, and by the way, I listened back to that, and it was a good one, by the way. It reminded me that my chief and primary interest in all this stuff is not political, but actually psychological. What I want to know is not about systems, frankly, because I don't believe in any of them, but about selves and minds, even hearts. What fascinates me is the problem of getting our understanding of human nature right and discovering what problems that are often political and social, arise when you get your picture of human nature wrong. So, while I will always find Thucydides to be important as a prerequisite for speaking effectively about, for example, international relations, to me, no one should speak about international relations who hasn't first done quite a deep dive on the kinds of subjects that you encounter in something like Buddha's Diamond Sutra. Almost there, by the way. One thing that interests me is that I've been reading now for like 25 years, and it's striking how often my earlier reading seems to have prepared me precisely for the life that I lived after I did the reading. And understand what I mean here. I'm saying I could have read almost anything when I was 23 in grad school. I had all kinds of time on my hand. No wife, no kids, just a fish tank and library access at a Research One institution. But I chose to read X, Y, and Z. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say I have literally thanked God for the choices I made back then. For instance, I don't know when I would have had the time to read Dostoevsky's 5 major novels since my 20s, but man, I'm glad I did back then. But more to the point than that, it turns out I've suffered. And yeah, I realize this is kind of breaking the fourth wall, but do you notice, you Straussians, how deeply I'm burying it? Episode 68, halfway through the episode, in a discussion of, natural law and the Buddha or something. Anyway, yeah, here's the 2-cent summary of my life since I was 26 or so. I had gotten fat by the time I was 23 because I was such a weird picky eater as a child, just basically eating like bread and cheese products. But By 26, I at least figured out that you got to exercise, so I wasn't so fat anymore. However, I had been, as I said, an extremely picky eater, and even at 26, I was just beginning to eat like a normal person. You know, like, I had never, like, you wouldn't believe this, but I had no meat between, like, age 2 and 25 or something, because it seemed gross to me, or whatever. And that's who I was. And then at 26, I met my now wife. At the time, I was reading things like, well, all my 19th century Americans, and also contemporary poetry and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, as well as stuff like Jeremy Narby's Cosmic Serpent and Michael Harner's Way of the Shaman. And E.R. Dodds, if I remember correctly. And then, around age 27, started writing my dissertation on ethics and aesthetics in American literature. 28, got engaged, married at 29, had a little mystical experience in there somewhere. Won't speak of that here. Moved to North Carolina because that's where the job was. And then developed, right here, just a little red splotch on my forehead. No biggie, I'll ignore it. I mean, it doesn't even itch, who cares? But, you know, it was on my face, and wife suggested I see a dermatologist. Okay, can't hurt. Had never been to a dermatologist before. The doctor prescribed steroid creams. The creams are steroids. They worked for a bit, but then they sort of stopped working, and so back to the dermatologist. More creams, stronger creams. They kind of work, but then they stop working again. Back to the dermatologist, and the cycle intensifies. The rash gets worse. 5 years later, by age 35, I have tenure, but my skin has become a constant bother. At that point, I've been to 5 or 6 different dermatologists. When finally I make the trek up to Wake Forest Research Hospital to see the best dermatologist in the state. Of course, if you have a skin disease for 6 years, you've been doing nothing but searching for remedies on WebMD, and you're like the world expert on it. So this guy gave me some insane diagnosis that was obviously wrong, and offered to put me on an experimental new biologic that would basically shut down my immune system. It came with a black box warning on it. Keep in mind, I had never had worse than just an itchy elbow before I started seeing dermatologists. My parents moved to be close to me and my kids in 2014, and so I was expecting, like, yay, you know, years of golf and fun to come as they're retired and they live nearby and stuff. And then in 2015, I discovered this website called itsan.org by Googling, you know, symptoms. Symptoms like motherfucking intense bone-deep itch constantly. And, you know, I went through the whole thing. Like, I went through, is it scabies? Is it ringworm? Do I have Lyme disease? Like, I kept going back to the doctors and so on. On May 10th, 2016, I finally stopped using the creams altogether. Cold turkey, as basically you have to do when you realize that they aren't working anymore. In fact, they're only making things worse. This next part I can't even begin to describe, but if you want, you can picture a bleeding mummy who smells like death, unable to get out of bed, stumbling every morning to the bathtub, which offered a certain kind of relief all year, from May to November of 2016. Every single day consisted of 13 hours in the bathtub, refilling it to warm it up every 30 minutes or so. Wife bringing me food, crying because of the searing pain whenever I had to get out of the water to pee every couple hours. And then 11 sleepless hours in bed, wrapped in gauze, bleeding, shedding skin, and scratching until my fingernails became infected or fell off. Feeling like there was a literal fire in my bones, my neck emanating heat, I mean, you could feel it with your hand if you didn't mind touching the ooze leaking from me. Then, after about 6 months like that, the symptoms changed, and all of a sudden, water contacting my skin became intolerable. I felt like I was shrink-wrapped in my own skin. Like it was so tight that every movement felt like it was splitting my skin. So no baths, no showering at all from Thanksgiving to Christmas. And then after that, I basically have been able to shower every 7 to 10 days. It always hurts. I have to do it in cold water, and I feel crappy for 2 to 3 days afterwards. 2017, 2018, sleep was still very rare. I mean, literally, I think there was a time I went a whole month without sleeping. People will say, you couldn't have done that. Well, you weren't me. Sweating stung incredibly bad, so I had to stay indoors all summer. Gabapentin and hydroxyzine took the edge off barely, but I was in pain 24 hours a day for 18 months. So I took a year of medical leave from work, and I couldn't get any more medical leave, so I went back to work too soon. Very uncomfortable, rushing back to my office, scratching my armpits, like, That fall, while I taught classes to undergrads, I would stand there with a t-shirt with the neck cut out of it and ice packs under my armpits, just coping. I explained all this to my students the best I could. I mean, they were good sports about it, but I basically just forgot about the embarrassment of it. The technical term for all of this, by the way, is an iatrogenic illness, which is to say an illness caused by medication. I mention that because I just saw a thing about Justin Murphy doing a show with Nina Powers soon about Ivan Illich, who wrote a book in 1975 called Medical Nemesis, where he popularized this idea of medicine-caused disease. Maybe needless to say, I mean, yes, this experience probably did contribute to my mistrust of institutions, medical and otherwise. Red-pilled by suffering, you see. Oh, and by the way, while I'm here, I should also do an episode on the unrelated short story Death of Ivan Illich by Leo Tolstoy. Someone remind me. Continuing the suffering story, I'm almost done. In 2018 and 2019, my skin wasn't quite as bad, a little bit of a reprieve, but I still couldn't sweat without serious pain and hives and crazy itching and so on, and I couldn't bathe or shower regularly. And the itching never left me, and then in early 2020, the skin condition flared up again, as it is known to do with this condition. By the way, good news, the long-term prognosis, which apparently means more than 5 years at this point, is supposed to be very good and ultimately conclude with total resolution, normal skin, the skin you had before all this. So looking forward to that. But basically early 2020, I lost my job for, reasons. And then, so, I mean, like in sum, I've missed about 5 summers in a row, basically outdoors with my kids, with only a few exceptions where I felt well enough to go to the beach. To this day, I really only feel comfortable wearing an old 50-50 modal cotton mix royal blue t-shirt by Kirkland and a well-worn hoodie. Everything else feels like sandpaper on my skin. I have to change still my bed sheets most mornings to wash them, either because of blood or because there's skin shed all over them. I have to vacuum up skin from all over the house regularly. I still haven't golfed with my dad. My 2-year-old looks at my skin now and sees, the latest scrapes and scratches and says, "Bad medicine, Dad." And I say, "Yeah, buddy, don't worry, it can't get you." Oh, and also, because it helps, I have to watch my diet, so I can't eat dairy, grains, nightshades, legumes, eggs, alcohol, seeds, soda, and so on. In fact, I'm currently trying an all celery juice diet for 18 hours out of every day. Hence the juicer that I ordered, watching the review of the juicer by the Matrix Oracle Lady. That's pretty much it for the story of my skin and my suffering, but I will say, like, I'm not arguing with you about it. You can look up itsan.org and whatever, call it a cult or think it's fake or whatever. I really don't care. But here's what I do care about. There's this line in Aeschylus's play, The Agamemnon, where he says, quote, "He who learns must suffer. And even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God." And that resonates with me, you guys. I was watching a video by Ken Brown yesterday where he was talking about some stuff, and he was almost going to do some of this kind of confessional talk about himself and his struggles. And then he was like, nah, I'll hold off. This isn't for the channel. But I realized, you know what? No, like, yes, it is. I'm reading Montaigne, and it's beautiful to me how he says, this book is about me. I'm trying to put a man on display here, you know? And so everything I talk about is just something to talk about, but like beneath it all, we're talking about me. There's also a fine line in the book of Job. You know Job, the guy who had skin disease, worms in his flesh, who scraped his own flesh with the broken shell, exactly the same way I scrape mine with the sharper inner edge of the lid to my zinc oxide cream. There's a line where Job says in chapter 19, "And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another." And this one, man, this one just slams me now, flattens me, you know? I mean, because of my experience, you understand what I'm saying? But like, I had read it before. But as Job says, he says in chapter 42 of the book, "I had heard of you with my ears, but now I see you with my own eyes." Anyway, if all of this sounds like me trying to guilt you into joining my Patreon, it's really not. Though I have certainly wept, even recently, in praying for this crazy condition to just resolve. But in spite of that, I am also and mainly grateful for the gift of this suffering because it has been the vehicle of my learning. What I have learned in this way certainly cannot be summarized. And although I sometimes recognize reflections of this wisdom in literature, you wouldn't be able to see those same reflections in the literature unless you have experienced this for yourself or some comparable suffering. Okay, but enough of this build-up, right? Give us the money shot, Casey. Well, here it is. When I was 28 years old, I read the Diamond Sutra 3 or 4 times. I was really into it. And during the worst of my suffering, back in 2016, when I couldn't sleep for many nights, the Diamond Sutra, as well as a few others, Inferno, the Odyssey, the Gospels, of course, came back to me, transfigured, as it were. But of course, it wasn't they that had been transfigured. It was myself, it was me, it was I, or whatever you say. I had been given ears to hear by my suffering. Anyway, this is what I heard. In the second chapter, Buddha's beloved disciple Subhuti asks him, "What should sons and daughters of good families do to help quiet their drifting minds and help subdue their craving thoughts?" Buddha's reply includes these lines, quote, "Those who follow what I am about to say here will be able to subdue their discriminative thoughts and craving desires. It is possible to attain perfect tranquility and clarity of mind by absorbing and dwelling on the teachings I am about to give. So that's sort of the prologue to the teachings of the Diamond Sutra. And even here, I hope you can hear how it came to me as I tore my flesh in bed, 3 a.m., skin sticking to the sheets, my wife waiting on me all day. Right then, it came to me. Tranquility, clarity of mind. And it came in part because I had thought seriously about Buddha's sermon before all the suffering began, you see. It came to me as a memory, but then it became real, not conceptual. Peace of mind, even in the worst physical condition, right? In chapter 5, Buddha asks Subhuti a question. Subhuti, what do you think? Can the Buddha be recognized by means of his bodily form? And the answer comes from Subhuti. No, most honored one. The Buddha cannot be recognized by means of his bodily form. Why? Because when the Buddha speaks of bodily form, it is not a real form, but only an illusion. And Buddha confirms his answer. All that has a form is elusive and unreal. When you see that all forms are elusive and unreal, then you will begin to perceive your true Buddha nature. In one sense, yes, all who have bodily health are free, or so it seems to me these days. And all who are ill are prisoners of the body. But Buddha tells us there is kind of a way out, an escape hatch, hidden behind the poster of Raquel Welch, so to speak. And that's what the Diamond Sutra is about. There are 32 chapters in the Diamond Sutra. And my favorite is chapter 6. So I'm going to read that with you now and sort of talk through what I love about it. But keep in mind, it's still like the main content of the Diamond Sutra really kind of comes later. But what I'm talking about here is how, what he's talking about in this chapter is sort of how this process of awakening works. So I'll put it on your screens as we go here. Chapter 6. Subhuti respectfully asked the Lord Buddha, Most honored one, in the future, if a person hears this teaching, even if it is only a phrase or sentence, is it possible for that person to have a true faith and knowledge of enlightenment awaken in their mind? Without a doubt, Subhuti, even 500 years after the enlightenment of this Buddha, there will be some who are virtuous and wise, and while practicing compassion and charity, will believe in the words and phrases of this sutra and will awaken their minds purely. After they come to hear these teachings, they will be inspired with belief. This is because when some people hear these words, they will have understood intuitively that these words are the truth. But you must remember also, Subhuti, that such persons have long ago planted the seeds of goodness and merit that lead to this realization. They have planted the seeds of good deeds and charity not simply before one Buddhist temple or 2 temples or 5, but before hundreds of thousands of Buddhas and temples. So when a person who hears the words and phrases of this sutra is ready for it to happen, a pure faith and clarity can awaken within their minds. So on those first 3 paragraphs, I mean, what he says is what I'm trying to articulate, which is that there's something to do with the work you've already put in, and it was work that, like, you didn't know really even where it was going or what it was for, but it was earnest work. For me, it was reading things like this all through my 20s. Reading, trying to get all the work done, you know? Because I was in literary studies, so that was basically what I was supposed to be doing. And trying to learn, and not just in a way to get good grades, but like I was trying to, imbibe the wisdom, so to speak. And then, in good time, when the moment is right, this wisdom like blossoms for you, okay? All right, next 3 paragraphs. Subhuti, any person who awakens faith upon hearing the words or phrases of this sutra will accumulate countless blessings and merit. How do I know this? Because this person must have discarded all arbitrary notions of the existence of a personal self, of other people, or of a universal self. Otherwise, their minds would still grasp after such relative conceptions. Furthermore, these people must have already discarded all arbitrary notions of the non-existence of a personal self, other people, or a universal self. Otherwise, their minds would still be grasping at such notions. Therefore, anyone who seeks total enlightenment should discard not only all conceptions of their own selfhood, of other selves, or of a universal self, but they should also discard all notions of the non-existence of such concepts. Actually, let me pause there. I mean, that is an amazing paragraph, you guys. Like, somewhere in this sermon, there's a line that says, like, infinite merit will be accredited to him who teaches even 4 lines of this sutra to others. And that's what I'm trying to do here, I guess. I think this is incredibly valuable. By the way, if you're really interested, it's there's a guy named Nagarjuna, who was like, I can't even remember, 5th century or something like that, one of these early Buddhist monks who wrote about Buddhist logic and rhetoric. And one of the things, like, whereas in like Hegelian or like Aristotelian rhetoric, you're either going to get like a thing is or it is not. But in Buddhist logic, there's like 4 propositions, and it's like, I think it's like a thing is not, a thing both is and is not, a thing neither is nor is not, something like that. And that's part of the logic that's going on here. It's like Buddha's saying there aren't personal selves or universal selves or like any of this stuff, other people even. But then he goes, but don't get it into your mind that there is a no self or a no people or no, you know what I mean? So it's like he's really trying to like cut off every passage that would lead to concept or conceptualizing here. Basically get rid of that. Discard. Well, okay, now let's do the next paragraph, which is just such an amazing paragraph. And it applies to everything I think about literature and why I love analogies so much and why, like, and what I'm trying to do on this channel. And even like why I'm talking about my personal, suffering, which of course doesn't really matter to you. But if you understand it in the way that Buddha asks you to understand things, it can become a tool and not a tool that burdens you. Just like a way of, just a ladder, okay? When the Buddha explains these things, using such concepts and ideas, people should remember the unreality of all such concepts and ideas. They should recall that in teaching spiritual truths, the Buddha always uses these concepts and ideas in the way that a raft is used to cross a river. Once the river has been crossed over, the raft is of no more use and should be discarded. These arbitrary concepts and ideas about spiritual things need to be explained to us as we seek to attain enlightenment. However, ultimately, these arbitrary conceptions can be discarded. Think, Subhuti, isn't it even more obvious that we should also give up our conceptions of non-existent things? Just amazing. So I'm not going to continue on the Diamond Sutra, although I may come back later because I do read this every once in a while and like deal with like one chapter or do like a short, one of my Godward shorts on this. But anyway, I wanted to say, because like as I was lying awake last night, sort of scratching, to be honest, I'm having a flare lately. I was thinking like, I can't remember I was thinking something about the crap that people are always talking about, politics or whatever, and Western civilization or white people or Christendom or empire or globalization, all that stuff was kind of running through my mind. And I realized that like, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it necessarily. It's not like a sin or anything to think like that, but that, like, you guys should see the hydrangeas outside my window right now, you know? I mean, like, you could also think about that while you're falling asleep. Or, like, when I was younger, I used to replay baseball games in my head, you know? Or, like, at-bats. Or basketball or whatever. Like, and it's amazing how much physical memory we retain. And a lot of this can be nonverbal. It's not judging either, right? Like, it's kind of like re-perceiving. You're just going through the files again. And I think it's a really effective kind of meditation to sometimes, and it's almost like it is meditation, because what will happen is, as you're trying to do this, if you have the kind of mind that I do, which tends in the direction of abstractions, you need to do this like consciously, intentionally, because what you'll notice is, like, if I go to sleep tonight and I just try to picture the trees and shrubs and flowers in my backyard that I love tending to, and I just kind of, in my mind, walk through the garden. What happens is, as I walk, some stupid politics ideas will often bubble up and try to, like, interfere or get in the way. And again, there's nothing wrong with talking about politics, but, like, don't forget the journey of awakening or selfhood, or yeah, I mean, like, one time when I was 21 or so, my grandpa had a heart attack. He was getting older. I asked him and my grandma, like, what is it all about? I'm 21. I don't understand yet. My grandma said something about the hokey pokey. You put your left foot in, you put your right foot in, do the hokey pokey. That's what it's all about. My grandpa said, know thyself. And I was like, that's it? And he was like, that's all I got for you. And I was like, man. So that's a project that's worth, like, returning to in between your sessions that are about, Deleuzian meta-ethics or whatever. Like, you see what I'm saying? This is part of what this channel's interested in investigating. Anyway, we do not have a secret stream this Friday night. And I don't have many plans for the secret streams after that. So if you have advice, patrons, if you have things you want to talk about, let me know. Upcoming episodes, I'm going to do one on Montaigne pretty soon. I'm just sort of picking out essays. I'm going to do the one on Ivan Illich. Eventually, I'd like to get to Plutarch. I gotta get back. It's been 20 years since I've read my Plutarch, so I have to, I guess, make the effort again. And let's see, 19th century. I got to do. There's so I kind of, the other day I started the Blithedale Romance because Ken Brown was talking about, like, doing things in real life or whatever. By the way, Ken, if you're still watching, I mean, I hope my story about the skin gives you some sense. It's like, obviously, I would love to jump in a car and drive around the country with you. I literally can't. It's too hot out. I start sweating and crying from the sweating. And I've got kids and a wife and so on. So, be cool. Book of Job is the other episode I want to do in the near future. And I think the episode for Job will be on friendship, actually, because I just love that chapter where his three friends start accusing him of, like, it must be your fault. You change your diet, cut the gluten out. You must have offended God. No one suffers like this who is innocent, and so on. And at the end of the story, God comes down pretty hard on those three friends for not being the best of friends to Job. Okay. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time to the Godward Podcast. Bye-bye.